And today I'm delighted to be with Brennan O'Donnell from Frontline Ventures. Brennan, so good to be with you today.
Good to see you, Matt.
Yeah, and so this isn't our first time together. We met way back in 2012 when you were leading strategy and ops at Yammer, right?
Yeah, we've known each other for a long time. It's been great.
Yeah, at
Congrats
least
on
one
the
of us will
success
say
since
too
then.
long. Who knows which one, but it's great to be with you today. And I'm excited because we've got a really interesting topic today. You're now with a venture firm that specializes and has expertise in crossing the chasm, as it were, and the chasm being the Atlantic, right? So love to hear a little bit about your role as a partner at Frontline Ventures. So can you tell us a little bit about the firm itself and maybe a little bit about what you do there?
Sure, absolutely. So Frontline as a firm, obviously a venture capital firm, we've been around about 10 years and our heritage is grounded in early stage investing in Europe. So seed, pre-seed, across three different funds. We have a few €100 million under management, probably close to 100 different companies at this point in time. And it's all B2B as a focus, but apart from that, really broad in terms of the types of companies that we invest in. And then I co-lead our second practice, which we spun up about 2 or 3 years ago, where it's growth stage investing. And as you said, we focus on investing in US companies, and we specifically help them with European expansion. And the genesis for the growth fund was really based off of the operating experience of myself and my partner Stephen McIntyre. We worked together in the early days of Google in Europe for 5 or 6 years. And then I came back to the States, and my career through Yammer and a handful of other startups leading go to market, that was always the tip of the spear for European expansion. So it's been a big thread of my career, both leading go to market teams and expanding internationally. And Stephen then went and ran Twitter for about 5 or 6 years for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So we both kind of had this intersection of our careers. And as a result, we made a lot of mistakes with European expansion. We had a lot of successes, and our peer group, who had similar roles for some of the best companies in the world, would make some of the same mistakes again. And we kind of realized that we had these amazing investors around us, some of the best investors in the world, that would help in all sorts of different ways. But European expansion wasn't one of them. It just wasn't a place where they were sort of suited or where they wanted to spend their energy. And it's just a massive opportunity for companies. I mean, by the time companies IPO, 30% of revenue is coming from Europe. So it was sort of shocking to us that there wasn't a firm focused on this. And so we decided to create the fund within the Frontline brand and make the firm kind of a multi-stage firm. And that's the focus of our growth fund.
Well, I think there's a statistic that's going to shock a few people. So 30% of revenue at IPO stage, so not insignificant. I know some people are going to be thinking, yeah, I get it. But like, if I think back to some of the organizations that were early pioneering this, transatlantic experience, folks will be thinking about, well, hang on a second. Can't we just hire a local executive, pull them out of Oracle or Salesforce or SAP and just build it themselves? Why do founders need your expertise and broader help than doing it just like that, just pulling someone out of one of these companies and off they go?
Sure. Well, I mean, first of all, I think the whole reason that we've founded the fund, like I said, is born out of the fact that we've seen firsthand, time and time again, the best companies make the same mistakes over and over again. And really, I think foundationally, it's because us as Americans sort of generally underestimate the size of the opportunity of Europe. I mean, I mentioned the 30% of revenue, but also kind of overestimate how easy it's going to be and underestimate the complexity of it, right? And the companies that we're talking about, by the time you're expanding internationally, making mistakes isn't going to take the company down. They're not going to implode because they mess up, but they absolutely will, waste capital and, more importantly, waste time. And so really, European expansion is one of these places where, the companies that we invest in and that you and I, work with day in and day out, they innovate in so many different ways. But international expansion is not really a place to get terribly creative in innovation. It's really execution. And so the experience of making the right decisions and executing, sort of de-risking expansion is where we kind of come into play, right? Because while the questions are similar for every single company. Getting the combination of answers is usually kind of pretty bespoke for the companies that we work with.
So that's really interesting. It sort of makes me think honestly about the way we think about leadership teams, right? At the end of the day, it's about the first principles is asking the right questions, which is what I heard you just say, because the answers will be different, but most people don't know the questions to ask. And I think the mistake I keep seeing people make is I was trying to throw you a softball there because I've seen so many times where they do take that established European executive and make him or her the regional head. Problem is, they're not an entrepreneur and they've never built it. I mean, they joined these large firms when they were established with processes, capital, resources, and people. They wouldn't know the first thing about being first person on the ground and building it from the ground up. And then the second mistake I see people make is without any guidance at all, taking that US transplant and thinking dropping them in because they're going to bring our culture to London or Ireland and make it work, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So we've done the research on this, right? So we released a report about a year ago now where we took a look at the European expansions of close to 200 different US SaaS businesses over the last 15 years or so. We looked at all of the questions that you would talk about, talent decisions, location decisions, timing decisions, all of this. And on the specific point about GMs, within the first 2 years, 50% of the leaders that are hired are no longer with the company that they start. So it's one of the biggest mistakes. It's one of the biggest mistakes that companies make over and over. Yeah.
Wow. Well, let's talk about it. So folks who are listening are thinking, yeah, well, 30% of revenue sounds pretty important. What has to be in place for a company, a US-based company, to be ready to make the leap?
Sure. Well, timing is one of the most important decisions. And so the subset then of what are the core 3 or 4 things that, we advise the CEOs that we're working with, what are where do you want to be to make sure that, you're ready? How do you know when it's time to go? The first one is kind of obvious, like your go-to-market is humming in the US. You're certainly over product market fit. And, the go-to-market motion is never 100% done. You're never finished with it, but you're over that sort of intuitive point where you've got a pretty solid sense of for every dollar you put into the company, you know what you're going to be able to get out in terms of revenue, or at least like close to that point. If you're not there, you're not ready. You need to focus on kind of dialing that in first. The second is your executive team. And this can include some non-obvious pieces. So it's not just, do you have the right go-to-market leader? It's all of the functions. Do you have the person that is capable of running a global business for their respective function, from product through to HR, through to sales, marketing, et cetera? Because this really is a transformational moment for the company and for the CEO. It's the first big step where you're really saying, okay, we're not just a North American focused company, we're a global company. And so, there's different levels of experience and talent and across all of the functions, making sure you kind of have those key leaders in place. Capital is not really a problem anymore for these companies. Maybe it would have the way it would have been a few years ago. Every company is very well funded. So the way I think about the capital is not so much the capitalization of the company, but are you prepared to spend it? Are you prepared to invest and kind of overinvest again across all of the functions that you need to invest in to really make it successful? And then the last one is that it's a priority for the CEO. I mean, I think it is, you alluded to this question a minute ago, it is sort of a classic mindset of going, well, I'll just hire the local GM and, great, we're off to the races. It is a period of time, let's call it kind of a roughly a 12-month period, maybe a little bit less, where it has to be a top priority for the company, which means it has to be a CEO priority, right? And so having that, that buy-in from the founders on down is really important for that window of time.
Yeah, it's interesting. When you talk about this US-centric view of the world, one of the things that you mentioned globally experienced leaders, and if you take an example like product or product marketing in particular, simple things around localization, language, and laws. It's very nuanced. And I think the barrier to execution is a lot higher than a lot of people think. It's not about just shoving your marketing materials into Google Translate, right? So, so I think you make a great point about the profile of executive you need. Which makes me think about some of the folks that I see on their way there. Oftentimes, US companies will put inside sales organizations in the East Coast and look to run a European operation out of there for quite an extended period of time. What do you think about that? Is it a stepping stone? Is it something that can be done long term?
Sure. Well, it depends is unfortunately kind of the answer on that one. We've seen companies do it for a period of time, particularly during COVID. I mean, with the restrictions on travel, we saw a little, some more companies kind of experimenting with that just because it's lower risk. The traditional axiom I think is true. The larger your customer is, the closer you need to be to them to successfully sell to them. And that's true both geographically as well as cultural familiarity, right? And so we've seen it work successfully for a period of time. The more self-serve your product is, the more effective that can be. Certainly support, right? Like let's say typically customers, so I mentioned the 30% statistic, usually SaaS businesses today can see anywhere between 8 and 12% of revenue coming from Europe without doing anything, any focus. It's just organically, that's the early adopters that we kind of consistently see. So if you have a percentage of your customer base that you can see as European based and predominantly English speaking, supporting them with like a sales assisted motion or customer success on the East Coast and stuff, great kind of starting points. But we kind of get back to the advice we usually give is as soon as you're ready with those criteria that we mentioned earlier, you should go, right? You should, as soon as you're prepared to make the investment, you should make the investment. I know we'll talk a little bit more about timing in a minute, but I can elaborate on that. Because the local market in Europe is just seeing tremendous companies that are getting created. There's just fantastic businesses that are getting built. So you want to go as soon as you're ready to go.
Yeah, it's interesting too. And when people talk about Europe, they speak about it as though it's a single entity, right? And then, and the nuances about CIS or EMEA or MENA, depending on what you want to look at, the dark region, the Benelux. I mean, there's so much stuff that we're not really familiar with here. And I think it's a real mistake to think that you can treat it as a thing and run it out of the US for extended periods of time. I think what would be helpful is if you gave us perhaps one example that might come to mind of a company that's done really well and what you think sort of distinguishes them in their transatlantic mission.
Sure. Well, one other point actually on the last question was, we also have this concept of success amnesia that we talk about with CEOs a lot. Again, the companies, by the time they're expanding into Europe, they're doing really, really well. And it's very easy to forget all of the hard work you had to put in to get to the point that you're at, right? Whether that was finding product market fit, whether it was A/B testing your marketing channels, whether it was building up your sales team and figuring out what works from an outbound and inbound, all of these things, you're all of a sudden working. And it's really easy to forget what you had to do to get there. If you have your team in the East Coast or in the US, you're going to have success initially, right? Your product is going to have early adopters. I guarantee people will hit their quota. You're going to make those initial sales, but you're not necessarily going to be capturing the learnings and either validating, are these things actually working in the new market we're focused on? Or do we need to kind of take a different approach because you're just going to be kind of catching the fish that are jumping in the net, right? So anyways, that was on the last question, but it's another kind of important piece of, having people local is the only way you can capture that. In terms of companies, and we've worked with so many great companies that have done this well. A recent example is Lattice, a company that we're fortunate to be investors in. They officially launched in the UK in September, but actually started building out the presence there in Q1 of this year. And it goes back, what's made them successful kind of goes back to the points we talked about are what's important. Number one, Jack's an amazing founder and had CEO buy-in and prioritization, right from the outset. It was one of their core kind of 4 or 5 goals for 2021 is successfully expanding into Europe. As a consequence, we also had strong executive team alignment. We spent sessions with the whole team together, getting them all aligned on what the goals were going to be, and how to execute on that. The timing, I think, was really interesting for them. The commitment to make it a priority was decided when we were still pretty much in the thick of lockdowns and the pandemic, and I think that speaks to for that company and the quality of the leadership team and sort of the strength of the business, accelerating out early of kind of that traumatic period that we were in was something that was not an obvious decision at the time. Easily could have said, let's wait another 6 months, but that has put them in a very, very strong position in terms of the hiring they've been able to make and how they've kind of prioritized the market. And I was just there last week meeting with Seth and the local team. I mean, since June, so in 3 or 4 months, they've gone from 0 to nearly 22 people in the office there. So it's incredible kind of growth.
Yeah. And, we're recording this here at the end of October 2021. And right now it's really hard to get great candidates and everyone's poaching like mad. So that's a real credit to them. And in particular, being a non-locally originated firm, because it's hard to get people's attention. Who are these people? Will it be the right culture? All that good stuff. So no, that is very good. So maybe to sort of reinforce the things you said are important, what are the top mistakes founders are making as they head to Europe?
Sure. Well, the way I think about the mistakes is, they are mistakes, but it's almost through the lens of the decisions that you make in about 4 different areas have a disproportionate impact on the success or failure with expanding, right? So the first one is timing. We spoke earlier about, how do you know if you're ready? So not being ready is the obvious piece of it. The less obvious piece is waiting too long. It's really easy to sort of say, oh, we're going to focus on the US market for an extended period of time because the market's so big and, we have so much to do here, and we're going to put that off a little bit. What a lot of US founders and investors sometimes don't appreciate is the amount of venture capital that has poured into Europe has doubled in the last 3 years. Last quarter was the most amount of venture investment ever in Europe. The quarter before that was the most amount of venture investment ever in Europe. And we're sitting now at the end of kind of not the end, but like we're 10 years into a run where there's been fantastic companies that have been created in Europe across all sectors. And the talent that's developed in those companies are going out and starting their own businesses, and they're well funded. Very well funded in a way that 10 or 15 years ago, we didn't kind of see that in Europe, the way we see it in the US kind of venture ecosystem. And, Americans don't, have a corner on the market in terms of creating great companies with great ideas. So waiting too long is now a recipe for seeding market to local competition. So that timing, threading that needle is really, really important. The decision there is really, really important.
Can't they just come to Frontline and ask for $100 million and buy up all the local competition, do a roll up? Can't we just do that?
we can talk about that after the podcast now.
Perfect.
So let's see the other couple areas in terms of more mistakes. Go to market. So getting your market prioritization right, investing the right amount. A classic example, I'll give it an easy one, but if you put a sales team and invest in the sales team, but don't invest in the marketing team, it's not going to be successful, right? So making sure that you prioritize and you develop the local strategies and invest appropriately. Talent and org design. So I mentioned, the importance of the local hiring. The non-obvious piece here is the decisions you make in terms of your operating cadence and your organizational structure at headquarters, right? So an example that I love to give is, let's say you've got a product prioritization process, right? And it's established and it's in place and it's driven based on the ROI of what product features, are going to deliver. And all of a sudden you go into a few new markets. And, if you are just making your product prioritization decisions off of the revenue you're going to see in the upcoming quarter or the upcoming year, you're never going to prioritize some of the things you need to do to make those markets successful, right? And so rethinking your systems and rethinking your org design, that's a big piece of it, not just locally. And then the fourth component is location. So, even in a world where there's teams that are natively distributed, even if you don't have an office per se, making a decision on where you're going to headquarter your company, which, is a long-term decision over 10 or 15 years, is really, really important. Historically, it's usually one of three cities. Again, we've done the research on this. It's usually London, Dublin, or Amsterdam. There's pros and cons depending on, the nature of the business, but that location decision is the fourth one.
I love it. Yeah, I'm gonna reiterate from personal experience what you said about investment in marketing in support of sales, because I personally have been victim of the North American marketing organization trying to serve as APAC, for example, Asia Pacific, right? Just, they do have to really invest in local expertise there for sure.
Yeah. Well, and it's like, getting quite tactical on that example, what I've seen time and time again, if you're a salesperson and you're in a local market and, all of your customer case studies are American companies, right? As opposed to local companies. I mean, there's a million different small examples, but collectively they kind of add up to it's just not a localized offering that's going to be compelling to customers.
Yeah, 100%. And it's kind of signaling, isn't it? Because then they're wondering themselves, well, how is my account management, customer success, and support going to be if at the front end, when you're most invested in getting my dollar, you're not even paying attention? So I think it just makes it a lot harder. So let's talk about some fun stuff. If a company wants to get funded and supported by Frontline and get all this fabulous expertise, what do they need to come prepared with? What must be a prerequisite before they come and chat to you folks?
Sure. Well, I'll set aside the seed side. So for a seed practice in Europe, it's kind of what you'd expect for really early stage investing. Things like, the team, founder problem fit with respect to the team. Do they have unique insight into the market? Does it have the potential to be very, very large, or is it already really large? Traction if that's relevant. But to focus on, the growth side, where I invest, one, we look for category leaders. So we invest in B2B businesses across a range of different categories. Is the company on the trajectory to be the leader in their specific category? Over the hump of product market fit, just as growth stage investors, we that's not the risk we take. We sort of take the risk of scaling, because that's specifically where we de-risk, is helping de-risk the challenges around scaling with international expansion. Exceptional growth and metrics. So, usually growth and net revenue retention, customer expansion, or whatever the metrics are that are appropriate for the company. So top class, metrics. The team kind of goes without saying, both the founder and then the ability, have you kind of built out a strong leadership team around you, because usually at this stage, that's there may be a few kind of holes on the executive bench, but have you been able to attract really top tier talent across all the different functions? And then the last one is global ambition. I mean, it seems like an obvious thing to say, but are you really prepared? Do you really want to build a global company? Because you can build a fantastic business, venture-backed business, and just focus on the US market, right? And that can be very, very successful. Do you really want to build a global business? And are you prepared to do the things that are required, make the investments that are required, sort of transform your company, transform yourself as a leader into that scale of business?
Yeah, that makes sense. It makes me think about just sort of being venture investable. You've got to have that really big vision and swing for the fences, as it were, type view of the world, don't you? So no, that's an interesting piece of guidance. I like that. Now, look, as much as for myself as people listening, I'm really interested. What's it like moving from an operating role to being an investor? How long have you been an investor now, Brennan?
Well, officially as a career, about 2 years. I mean, I've been angel investing for 10 years, but,
sure. Okay, this is
but
great.
in terms
so
of the career switch, about 2 years. Yeah.
Yeah. You've got past the honeymoon. What's it like? Tell us about that experience in terms of how you spend your time, what you think about, what's your perspective on it now?
Yeah. Well, I mean, at a personal level, I love it. I think a lot of career decisions are just tied to, what makes sense for you in the intersection of, what are you good at? What value can you provide? What do you like to do? Those sorts of things. A couple observations in no particular order. One, there are not a lot of ex-operators in venture, at least, less than you would think. I think less than sort of popular perception is. And there's even a fewer number that are ex go-to-market people. Typically, investors that have come from operating roles are founders or product people, generally speaking. So that's been really interesting, and I think a nice differentiation just when you talk to founders to be able to bring a go-to-market operating perspective. I think another interesting thing, again, it's kind of misconceptions about what being a venture investor is. You're a money manager. I mean, it's fantastic that we get to do it by working with high growth technology companies and founders that we love and help them in all these different ways. But you've got a lot of different constituents, and at the end of the day, you're a fiduciary to your LPs, right, and are responsible for their capital and returning that capital. And so we're stewards of tens of millions of dollars, and a lot of the things that come with that, require spending time in a lot of interesting areas that people don't necessarily appreciate because it's not as visible from the outside. For me, having that not been a part of my career at all historically, at the LP level at least, it's fascinating because it's really, really interesting to learn how these kind of ecosystems work. I think one or two interesting distinctions from operating roles, particularly on the go-to-market side, really long feedback loops, right? So we're talking about funds that are 8, 10, 12 years long, right? So not only is it a big commitment, but it's not like when you're going out and trying to, sell a new product to a market, and you're testing your pitch and you're testing your go-to-market strategy, and you kind of figure out pretty quickly, does it work, does it not work, we'll try something different. You really don't know if you're good at this for a very long period of time. And so that's different. It's also an individual sport. So at Frontline, we very much take a team mentality. But at the end of the day, compared to, running teams and celebrating wins, team and being a leader of, larger teams and stuff, it is much more a kind of an IC role, right? I mean, if you don't send an email or pick up a phone, no one's going to do it for you. And so that's different, but it's also kind of nice at this stage in my career, frankly, kind of switching to that because it's different. And I think the last thing I would say is, if you're intellectually curious, it's fantastic. It's the best job in the world. You get to spend your time learning about all sorts of different areas, meeting all sorts of different types of people. Which just means that it's lots of diversity in terms of what you're doing, and nothing is ever dull. So,
love it. Well, Brennan, this has been fascinating. So, a couple of great takeaways, a few good takeaways there for people thinking about making the cross across the Atlantic. And if they want to find you, it's going to be Brennan O'Donnell. I'm guessing you've got a couple of followers on LinkedIn there, Frontline Ventures. So I'm sure you'll be.
Yeah, just Brennan at frontline.vc is fine. So.
Say that again, that email?
Oh, it's Brennan at frontline.vc.
All right, look out. Here comes a flood to your inbox. Fantastic stuff. Thanks a lot, Brennan. Really appreciate spending some time with you today, and look out for those emails.
Great. Thanks, Matt.